It is just after midnight. A man is on his knees in the dirt. His face is pressed almost to the ground. His friends are a few feet away and somehow 1,000 miles away, asleep. Listen closely and you can hear him breathing. Not normal breathing, the kind of breathing that sounds like someone has a hand around his throat. If you walked past this scene in the dark, knowing nothing about who he was, you might think you were watching a man die. You would not be wrong. This is not the cross. This is hours before the cross, in a place almost nobody stops long enough to understand. It has a name, and the name is the first clue. Once you know what that name actually means, you will never read this story the same way again. By the end of this, you're going to understand why ancient Israel built one of its most violent pieces of machinery in this exact location, and why of all the places on earth, God chose to kneel down inside it.
Cross the Kidron Valley, just outside Jerusalem's eastern wall, and the ground starts to rise. This is the Mount of Olives. Even today, gnarled olive trees stand on this slope, some claim by tradition to be over 1,000 years old, rooted in soil that has watched this same hillside since before the Gospels were written. At night, the whole city of Jerusalem would have been visible from here. Torchlight, rooftops, the temple silhouetted against the stars. Beautiful, peaceful, the kind of view you'd bring someone you loved. It's not an accident that this is where it happened. The place is called Gethsemane. Most people hear that name the way they hear Bethlehem or Nazareth, just a label, a dot on a map. But here's what most people miss. Gethsemane isn't really a name, it's a description. It comes from two words, Get meaning press and Shemanim meaning oils. Put them together and you get something startling. The place of the oil press. This wasn't poetic, it was literal. Somewhere on this hillside stood the heavy stone equipment used to crush olives for oil, the kind every village in Judea needed for cooking, for lamps, for the temple itself. Now watch what happens when you understand how that machine actually worked. Getting oil out of an olive happens in stages. The very first drops, squeezed out by nothing more than the olive's own weight, before any beam ever came down, were considered the purest oil there was. Clear, clean, set apart specifically for the temple's lamps. But a few clear drops won't light a city. To get enough oil to fill every lamp in every home in Judea, enough to anoint a king, enough to outlast a whole winter, you needed more than a trickle. You needed the press, the full beam, stones the size of a man, lowered slowly, relentlessly, until there was nothing left inside the olive to hold back. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. The abundance the world actually needed never came from a light touch. It came from the heaviest weight anyone was willing to apply. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. Because what happens in this garden tonight is going to follow that exact pattern, and it's going to change how you see every drop of oil mentioned in the rest of Scripture. A few hours earlier, this man had been sitting at a table with his closest friends, eating a meal that Israel had eaten every year for over 1,000 years to remember a different kind of deliverance. He had taken bread, broken it, said, "This is my body." He had taken a cup, said, "This is my blood." Nobody at that table understood what they had just witnessed. They wouldn't understand for years. Then he stood up and he led 11 men. One had already slipped out into the night, down the steps of the city, across the dry bed of the Kidron, and up into the trees of Gethsemane. He brought 3 of them, Peter, James, John, deeper into the garden. These were the same 3 who had seen him glowing with light on a mountain, the same 3 who had once watched him speak and a storm went silent. If anyone had earned the right to witness what was coming, it was them. "Stay here," he told them. "Watch with me." Then he went a little further, alone, and did something none of them had ever seen him do. He fell to the ground. Here's where everything changes. The Gospel of Mark, writing in Greek, uses a specific word to describe what hit Jesus the moment he stepped away from his friends, Ekthambeisthai. It's not a word for sadness, it's a word for horror, the kind of dread that hits a body like a physical blow. Mark pairs it with another word,
perilipos, sorrowful to the point of death. Then Luke, a physician by training, adds something even more specific, agonia. You already recognize part of that word, agony. But the original meaning runs deeper than pain. In the Greek world, agonia described the tension an athlete felt right before a contest, that unbearable, coiled, full-body dread in the seconds before the starting signal, when the body already knows what's coming and every nerve is screaming. This wasn't sadness. This was a man standing at the edge of something his entire body was bracing against. And then Luke records a detail that should make you lean forward. His sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. For centuries, skeptics dismissed this as exaggeration, dramatic flourish, nothing more. But modern medicine has a name for what Luke described: hematidrosis. Under extreme psychological distress, capillaries near the sweat glands can rupture, mixing blood with sweat. It's rare, it's real, and it's documented in cases of people facing what they believe is certain imminent death. A first-century physician, with none of that medical knowledge available to him, recorded a symptom that wouldn't be clinically explained for almost 2,000 years. That's important. The connection is impossible to ignore. This was not performance. This was a body responding to something the soul could barely survive.
So what was he actually afraid of? This is where most retellings stop too early. They skip straight to Jesus was afraid of dying and move on. But crucifixion wasn't a surprise. He had already told his disciples plainly, multiple times, exactly how he would die. Men far weaker than him had walked to Roman crosses without collapsing into hematidrosis on the ground beforehand. So it wasn't just the nails. Something else was happening. Listen to his actual words. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." A cup. Think back to that table just a few hours earlier. At a traditional Passover meal, 4 separate cups are lifted across the night, each one tied to a different stage of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. Tradition holds that the third of those 4 cups, the one lifted near the end of the meal, carries a specific name, the cup of redemption. Most scholars believe that's the exact cup Jesus lifted at that table, the one he handed to his friends and called his blood, poured out for many. So when he kneels in this garden hours later and asks for this cup to pass from him, he isn't introducing some brand new symbol into the night. He's picking back up the very cup he had just redefined at dinner. Only now, he's staring straight at what it's actually going to cost him to make that redefinition true. In the world he came from, a cup wasn't a small thing. Throughout Israel's prophets, a cup was a loaded symbol. The cup of God's wrath, the cup of judgment poured out on rebellion, the cup nations were forced to drink when they had exhausted divine patience. To drink the cup meant to absorb the full weight of consequence for sin. Not your own sin, but to stand in the place where judgment lands. Now here's the part nobody talks about. This man hadn't sinned, not once, not in thought, word, or deed, according to everything the Gospels claim about him. And yet, he was looking into a cup that held every act of cruelty, every betrayal, every act of violence, every quiet private sin ever committed by every human being who would ever live, past tense and future tense. All of it, somehow, poured into a single cup that he, and only he, was being asked to drink to the bottom. That's not a man afraid of physical pain. That's a man staring directly into the full weight of human evil and asking if there's any other way to deal with it. And for one unbearable moment in the dark, under the trees, the answer was no, there wasn't.
At first glance, that seems like just a desperate prayer in a desperate hour. But it wasn't an accident that this happened in a garden. Go back to the very first pages of the story, to a different garden with a different man facing a different kind of test. In that first garden, a man named Adam was given a command, surrounded by abundance and tempted to take something forbidden. He wasn't suffering, he wasn't crushed by pressure. He had everything he could possibly want. And the test was simple: trust God or reach for more. He reached. He fell, and everything broke. Notice the object at the center of his failure, a tree, something rooted, something growing, something he reached out and took from with his own hand. Hold on to that detail. It's going to come back around before the end of the story, in a way the New Testament writers clearly believed was not a coincidence. Now look at the second garden. Here is a second man. The Gospels will later call him the last Adam, and his test is the mirror image of the first. He isn't surrounded by abundance, he's surrounded by horror. He isn't being tempted to take something forbidden, he's being tempted to refuse something required, to let the cup pass, to walk away, to save himself. The first man's test was easy, and he failed it. This man's test was nearly unsurvivable, and he didn't. And notice, please notice this, in both gardens, the people closest to the central figure failed to stay alert. In Eden, the danger arrived and humanity didn't see it coming. In Gethsemane, Jesus asks Peter, James, and John to stay awake and watch with him, and within the hour, all three are asleep. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Humanity, even at its most devoted, still can't stay awake for its own salvation. It has to be done for them while they sleep. Maybe you felt that before, wanting to be strong for someone you love in their darkest hour and discovering your body just gives out. Maybe that's exactly where you are right now. If it is, sit with this. The moment your strength runs out is not the moment grace runs out. It's usually the opposite. Before we keep going, if this is connecting something for you, something you've heard 100 times in church but never actually seen this way, that's worth pausing on for a second. Drop a comment with the moment that hit you. And if you want to keep walking through these overlooked corners of the Gospels together, this is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists for, so consider sticking around for the next one. Okay, back into the garden. While he prayed, while his friends slept, something else was moving through the dark. Torches, soldiers, and one familiar face. Judas, one of the 12, a man who had eaten at that same table hours earlier, leads an armed crowd straight to the one place where Jesus could be found alone and unguarded. And when he reaches him, he doesn't point, he doesn't shout an accusation. He kisses him. In that world, a kiss on the cheek was a sign of devotion, the greeting of a disciple to his teacher. Judas chose the single most intimate gesture of loyalty available to him and used it as the signal of betrayal. This wasn't random cruelty. It was prophecy walking out in real time. Centuries earlier, King David had written his own psalm about exactly this kind of wound. A trusted friend, someone who had shared a meal at his own table, turning around to strike at him from the inside. David never met Judas. He couldn't have. But the pattern of betrayal by intimacy was old enough and consistent enough that it had already been written down 1,000 years before this particular kiss landed on this particular cheek. The wound of betrayal isn't new in this story. It's ancient. It's been foreshadowed since the Psalms, and it lands exactly where it was always going to land, through the door of friendship, not enmity. But here's what's almost more remarkable than the betrayal itself. By the time Judas's torch reaches him, Jesus is calm. The real battle, the only one that mattered, had already been fought, alone, in the dark, before the soldiers ever arrived. By the time the external enemy showed up, the internal one had already been settled. So what actually happened in those final moments before the soldiers arrived? What changed between the sweat-like blood collapse and the steady, almost serene man who stands up to meet his betrayer? One sentence. That's what changed. Not my will, but yours be done. 6 words in English, and they may be the most consequential 6 words ever spoken by a human voice. Because remember the first garden, remember Eden. The entire catastrophe of that first story can be reduced to one move. A human being chose my will over God's will. That single inversion, self over surrender, is the root every gospel writer believed had poisoned the whole human story ever since. And here, in this second garden, under this unbearable weight, a human will, fully human, fully afraid, fully capable of saying no, chooses the opposite. Not my will, yours. This is the hinge. Everything before this sentence in the story of Scripture has been building toward a moment when a human being, facing the worst the cup could offer, says yes to God instead of yes to self. Everything after this sentence flows from the fact that this time, someone finally did. And notice where this leads. Within hours, this man, who in this garden refused to reach for an escape, will be lifted onto a different kind of wood. The first man reached out and took fruit from a tree, and death entered the world through his hand. This man will be nailed to a tree, and death will be absorbed into his hands instead. Same image, two different trees, one story finally completing itself. Remember the press. Remember the name of this place. The place of crushing. The place where enough oil for everyone only ever came from the heaviest weight. Centuries before this night, the prophet Isaiah had written about a coming servant of God who would be crushed. That's the actual word used. Crushed for the wrongdoing of others, so that through his wounds, others could be made whole. At the time, nobody fully understood who that servant was. It read like a riddle. Now, look at where the riddle landed. Of every hillside in Judea, the final crushing of the human will of the Son of God happens at the one location named, quite literally, the place of the oil press, hours before his body would be broken on a cross the next afternoon. It wasn't a coincidence of geography, it was a signature. Because in Scripture, oil is never just oil. Oil is what anoints kings. Oil is what consecrates priests. Oil is the symbol, again and again, for the Spirit of God being poured out on a person, setting them apart, empowering them for something they could never do in their own strength. And the pattern never changes. The oil only flows after the pressing. Jesus is crushed in Gethsemane and crushed again on the cross. And what follows, just weeks later, is the Spirit of God being poured out on ordinary, frightened, sleep-prone people in an upper room in Jerusalem, transforming them into something they were never capable of being on their own. There's a calendar detail worth pausing on. The day the Spirit fell in that upper room wasn't a random morning. It was the Feast of Weeks, what the Greek-speaking world called Pentecost, the day Israel had celebrated for centuries as the first fruits of the harvest, the very first stalks of grain cut early and lifted up as an offering, a promise that a much bigger harvest was still standing in the field. The oil pressed out of one man, in one garden, on one impossible night, became the first fruits of a harvest that's still being gathered today. Every life that's ever been changed since. The weight came down on him so the oil could be poured out on everyone else. That's the whole hidden architecture of this night. The crushing was never the end of the story. It was the means of producing something that could only exist because of the crushing. And that something was poured out on people exactly like the three men who couldn't even stay awake to witness it. Maybe you have your own garden. Not a literal hillside outside Jerusalem, but a place in your life, maybe right now, where you're on your knees in the dark asking for a cup to pass. A diagnosis, a collapsed marriage, a decision that's going to cost you something you don't think you can afford to lose, a weight that's pressing down so hard you don't recognize your own breathing anymore. If that's where you are tonight, here's what this story actually offers you. Not a tidy answer, but a companion. Maybe nobody else is awake with you either. Maybe the people who love you most are doing their best and still falling asleep on you in your hardest hour. Not out of malice, just out of being human, just like Peter, James, and John. That doesn't mean you've been abandoned. It means you're in good company. He knows exactly what that kind of aloneness feels like because he lived through it first, in the dark, under those same kinds of trees. The God this story describes did not skip the garden. He did not wave a hand and remove the weight from a safe distance. He knelt in the dirt. He felt the dread climb into his own chest. He asked, honestly, desperately, if there was another way. And when the answer was no, he did not run. He stayed. He surrendered. And somehow, on the other side of that crushing, oil began to flow that is still being poured out today. The olive trees on that hillside are still standing, twisted, ancient, weather-beaten. The kind of trees that don't die easily, that keep producing fruit out of trunks that look like they should have given up centuries ago. Maybe that's the final image worth carrying with you. Not a man who avoided the press, a man who walked into the heaviest weight in human history and came out the other side as oil for everyone who would ever kneel in their own garden after him. The night didn't end in collapse, it ended in surrender. And somehow, impossibly, that surrender is still being poured out, drop by drop, into gardens just like yours tonight.